I'm Ellen Blue, and I teach at Phillips Theological Seminary. In fact, I hold the Muzan Biggs Chair at Phillips and the chair in United Methodist Studies, and I teach history of Christianity. I teach United Methodist history among my courses and United Methodist doctrine and advanced Wesleyan theology. And so I eventually see most of the Methodist students who come through Phillips, including Paul Stott, who's here at Boston Avenue right now, is one of my former students. And Bill asked me if I could come and teach for him this morning. And I first told him I was going to do something on United Methodist women. I'm going to Ohio at the end of the month and give a paper at a national conference on the history of United Methodist women, which are going to have their 150th anniversary coming up in 1919. But I really needed some slides for that, so what I'm going to talk about this morning is camp meetings. And some of you probably had family members who actually remembered having gone to camp meetings. Would that possibly be the case? Yeah. And out on this part of the country particularly, they were especially popular, but it's not just a Western phenomenon. These really began at Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801. When there was a vast outpouring of the Holy Spirit on, of all things, a group of Presbyterians. Just so unexpected. and they began to hold the camp meetings, and it became a real evangelistic tool, though, particularly for Methodists and for Baptists. And so the Methodists and the Baptists particularly adopted this means of reaching people and found many individuals drawn into their churches through this methodology. The first thing that I've passed out here is called Sacramental Scene in a Western Forest. And this is from the Library of Congress website. They have some artwork there. Now, just to begin with, in Methodism, of course, we have two sacraments, communion and baptism. And so the very word sacramental, it's kind of hard to connect with the kind of things that went on at the camp meetings, because most of the preachers would not have been authorized to serve sacrament, though some of them would have to serve Eucharist or communion anyway. But this is what the painter saw. He saw sacramental as meaning sacred. So it's a sacred scene in a Western forest. And if you look here, you can see that the preaching is clearly going on in this little building, she said, for lack of a better word, here at the front. And the purpose of this was for sound. Now, some of you probably have heard the stories about John Wesley going outside the church buildings in England and preaching in the open air, particularly to coal miners and to people who were unlikely to darken the doors of a Church of England church on Sunday morning. And there are stories about how far certain speakers could be heard, how much volume they were able to achieve. George Whitefield began as a Methodist, and he came to this country 7 times and did all sorts of outdoor preaching. And Benjamin Franklin, for one, was very skeptical about the stories of how many people could hear George Whitefield preaching, because he'd heard that 25,000 people could hear him, and he thought, that's ridiculous. So in his autobiography, there's a section where George Whitefield came to the town where he was. And so Franklin walked up to where he was sort of standing next to where Whitefield was, and then he stepped off to the point where he could not hear him anymore, and he figured out how much of an area he could have heard him from, and figured out how much space each person took to stand there, and did the math and decided that 35,000 people could have heard George Whitefield, which sounds amazing, but some of the great speakers of that time had that kind of lung power. But most of them needed a little bit of help. And of course, they didn't have this kind of help at that point. And so they would stand up and try to stand against a wall. Wesley preached on his father's tombstone one time and let the wall of the church send his voice out. So you can see in this little structure here that they have created a wall behind the speaker to help his voice. And by then it would have been his voice that went out toward the people. Now, these camp meetings were wonderfully popular, I think in part because people were hungry for some sort of religious experience, but let's face it, there also wasn't a lot else to do on the frontier. They did not have cable, and so when they heard that a camp meeting was coming, everybody would race out and come to that location. So much so that they really had to set things up to keep the rowdies, as they were called, from coming in and disrupting the meetings, or from the people who were at the meetings getting lured away into the bushes instead of staying at the meeting. So down here in the corner, you can see a couple of people who are quite well-dressed, who are standing there just observing, right down in your lower left corner. And it was actually something that the well-to-do settled folk of the town would come out and watch as a spectacle. So you can see these people are not really involved. They're just there to observe what these other people are going to do and to see what will happen. You can also see someone who is a hunter who happened to be passing by and who has come just to observe and see what this phenomenon is and what's going to happen. Now, if you look at this other piece that you already have there, you can see that it was not just spontaneous as to how these things happened, particularly after Francis Asbury got a hold of it. Why don't you go ahead and pass out the one on Asbury. Now, one of the statues out here in front of your church is of Francis Asbury, but if you're like me, you can't see very much from that high up, so I sent you a picture of him here. The circuit riders out on the frontier were all under Bishop Asbury's appointment. John Wesley finally was persuaded by the American Revolution that he was going to have to send some people over here who were ordained and who could actually baptize and serve Eucharist. And so he took the authority he understood he had from the New Testament. He ordained a couple of folks, and they came over here and they ordained Francis Asbury, who became the leader of the church here in America, the Methodist Church, until he died in 1816. And he rode, 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 until he died. He was understood to be the person that more people recognized when they saw him in this, what would be this country. Nobody other than George Washington was recognized by more people than Francis Asbury. because he was continually on his horse, moving around, meeting people. He wasn't a very effective public speaker, but what he was wonderful at was one-on-one relationships. And he would come and he would visit with everybody. He would stay in people's homes. He would laugh with them and listen to them and talk with them and really build a relationship. And so he was seen and recognized literally all over the country. And he knew his pastors, and he would send them out. You know, today we go to annual conference knowing whether our pastor is going to move or not. Both my husband and I are clergy, and when Jim started out, they would still go to annual conference and occasionally not know whether they were going to move the next week or not. And today we use something called a process of consultation so that you're supposed to know ahead of time. But in Asbury's day, they did not know till they got to conference where they were going. And he got so many complaints from so many people that he got to where he would have one of his assistants have his horse at the door, saddled up, and he would read the appointments as the last thing, and he would run out and get on his horse and ride away, so he wouldn't have to listen to people complain about where they were going to have to move or not get to move from. And you can see here, this is a statue of him in Washington, D.C., and it is just typical because he's clearly prepared for the weather. There used to be a saying that the weather wasn't fit for anybody but crows and Methodist preachers, because they would ride through anything and go and preach. And the complaint was, I moved out here to get away from this preacher, and the first thing I saw when I got to this place was a Methodist preacher. They were everywhere out on the frontier. So Asbury was pretty methodical as well. We think of John Wesley as being ultra organized and really almost over-organized, particularly when it came to his own life, taking his spiritual temperature every 15 minutes and, keeping close notes and that kind of thing. Well, Asbury was also pretty well organized. And so when he decided that the camp meeting phenomenon was going to catch on and be something that would be really useful in spreading the gospel in this land, he set to paper what they should look like. Now, this particular paper is not one of Asbury's plans, but it is a plan that is still available, and it does have some similarities to the ones that he would have used. There were several plans, and they had to do with what the ground looked like, a natural amphitheater. This is kind of shaped like a natural amphitheater where the speaking is going to go down here and the sound is going to go up. But that's kind of rare to find, and so normally the speaker's going to be up to let the voice come down. And the circle plan was understood to be very sacred, but this is a semicircle like your sanctuary here. And the people would come for 2 or 3 days at a time. This was a big event. And they would pack up the wagon and bring their food and be ready to stay there for 2 or 3 days. So you see these little blobs here are tents. And this word in the middle says fires for cooking. And then there would be another row of tents. And then here is the seating, and one side is seating for men and one side is seating for women. Now, in a lot of our churches, you can still go in, and there'll be a little section of pews over here and a little section of pews over there. And then there'll be a long pew in the middle, but sometimes there is a separator there in the middle of those pews. And you think, why is this here? This is really, inconvenient. But at the time, it was because some of our churches still carried on that tradition of men sitting on one side and women sitting on the other. And you see out here it says wattled fence. And again, they actually have constructed a fence here to deal with some of the problems that I told you about that went on. It was understood that a really good place to go meet women was to go to a camp meeting because they were going to be really excited by the things that went on there. And so there was a lot of understanding that this excitement would carry on into other areas as well. And so the understanding was that you could go meet a woman at a camp meeting and she would be friendlier than perhaps she otherwise would. So the fence was there for several reasons, as I said earlier. Now, they've got a water supply here, which is going to be necessary, of course. And one reason that we know that this is not Asbury's plan is because you can see right here these tents that are on sort of the wrong side of the speaker's platform is labeled Negro tents. Now, Asbury was absolutely in tune with John Wesley, who thought that slavery was an utter abomination. And so the Methodist Episcopal Church in this country had in its discipline that it was completely unacceptable for a Methodist to have enslaved people. And then, of course, when the Southern Church broke off, its discipline was exactly like the Northern Church, except they just left that line out. The Northern Church also was not perfect in its standing with Wesley and Asbury's stance. But be that as it may, we know that Asbury would not have drawn a plan that required a separation like this. So, but nevertheless, there's a lot similar here. Now, up here you see it says thick woods, but the whole thing did not come out on the copier, but let me read to you. You see right over here in this side, there's another little area there. Let me get my glasses. Old age is cruel. This says it's a boarded off area filled with straw, which the converted are to be put into that they might kick about without injuring themselves. Part of the words are off here on this particular copy. So they actually expect that those who are converted are going to exhibit the kinds of behaviors that today we would associate with a Pentecostal or Assemblies of God kind of denomination. And understand that those denominations came out of Methodism, all of the holiness traditions, the Nazarenes, the Assemblies, the Pentecostals, all came out of the Wesleyan holiness tradition. And so it was very common for someone to be slain in the spirit or to have manifestations of barking or yelping or any sort of behavior that was not what you would expect at, say, Boston Avenue on Sunday morning. But these were the phenomenon that were associated with the camp meetings, and enthusiasm was sort of the overall term for this, and it was very controversial whether a church should be enthusiastic or not. And one was good and the other was bad. Of course, in the 1970s, there was a charismatic movement in this country, and the Methodist Church had to have a long resolution in our Book of Resolutions about how people who were part of the charismatic movement and came to church shouldn't condemn their preacher if their preacher wasn't, and if the preacher was part of it, the preacher shouldn't condemn the people who weren't part of it, and vice versa. It goes on for page after page, asking people to just be civil and recognize that there were different ways of expressing one's religious conviction. But it is a very sensitive topic and one that really disturbs people when their way of worshiping is questioned. So this is, history kind of happens over and over again. And in the 1970s, we ran into some of these same questions about how worship ought to express itself. I told you they were there for several days. I want to read you a little bit of history about it. This is from a book called Organizing to Beat the Devil. And that's about as Methodist as you can get. We're organizers, and we get ourselves together and go out, and we're against whatever we're against. The bishop, and at this time, of course, that would have been Francis Asbury, referred to the outdoor revivals as field fighting and as fishing with a large net. He wrote hard on his preachers and presiding elders, urging them to report the camp meetings held in the course of a year, the numbers attending, the souls professing converting grace, and the days of continuance. So see, we might go out here and we might have this really informal, really enthusiastic camp meeting, but then we wanted to fill out a report on it later. Again, this is so Methodist, right? Embodying the norms of Methodism, Bishop Asbury combined orderliness with zeal, carrying both the torch and the T-square. If the camp meetings were to become Methodist, they would have to become Methodistic, strict in form and reliable in plan and structure. Father Asbury did his best to have the camp meeting incorporated in the chart of the church so that preachers would actually be required to hold outdoor revivals as a part of their work. He did not succeed, but he did manage to have camp meetings held in conjunction with conferences, the last quarterly conference of the year, which met in the spring, and the annual conference, which met in the summer. The arrangement was not altogether popular, as the journals of some of the preachers show. One, Benjamin Lakin, had some acid comments to make about sleeping in the woods at the annual conference, when he looked forward to a few decencies and amenities and a chance to sleep in a good bed several nights running at the yearly meeting of the preachers. So finally, I'm going to go get to sleep in a bed, and Asbury says, no, you have to have a camp meeting at annual conference. So this was not one of his more popular rulings. The 4-day period was standardized. Meetings ran from Friday afternoon or evening till Monday. People got readily accustomed to the routine. It was said that the good people go to the camp meetings on Friday, the backsliders show up on Saturday, the rowdies on Saturday night, and gentlemen and lady sinners on Sunday. So schemed were the services that the preaching was not only scheduled, but graded by the time the speaker was put up. Those who led the opening services on Friday night were known to be the third-rate platform performers. You knew that the preacher who took the 8 a.m. service the next day would be better, but not the best. It was understood that those who spoke at 11 o'clock would be the intellectual Samsons of the encamped gathering. Plans went even further. Work schedules were arranged in shifts so that some of the preachers slept while others labored in the pulpit. Leaders took their places at the speaker's stand. The exhorters were strategically located in the audience, and aides to the penitents stood waiting at the altar. Now, what does that remind you of? Have you ever seen a Billy Graham meeting on TV? One of his crusades. And as soon as he gives the invitation, people stand up and start walking. Well, those are people who are planted in the audience to stand up and start walking so that a person who is convicted won't have to be the first one to stand up. And they recruit lay people from the local areas to stand down at the altar and give material out and so forth, So it's not just a spontaneous thing of the heart. It's also actually planned for and arranged ahead of time. So they would also have folks who were ready to deal with folks who got converted. Now, the term exhorter is kind of interesting. What do you think of when you hear exhorter? Yes, I'm going to stand here till someone speaks. Yeah, that's my husband is shaking his finger. Yes, you need to do different. You need to stop what you're doing, and you need to go do something else instead. Wesley actually licensed women to preach. But when he died, the church decided that wasn't such a good idea, and they backed off of that. And it took a long time for women to get the ability to preach again in the Methodist system. But they would give women exhorters' licenses. Now, an exhorter would be someone who could tell you their personal testimony, or they could tell you that you needed to get right with God, but they could not interpret the Scripture. They couldn't open the Bible and do anything that spoke of actually interpreting Scripture. So the exhorters that were down there were not the ones who had given you the message from the Bible, because that was only for preachers. But once you got down there, they could give you advice on how you ought to behave, all right? So that's what the exhorters were there for. Women could be evangelists or singers, traveling evangelists, and a lot of them would sing, and they would give a really long introduction to their songs, okay? So there were ways of sort of getting around this. And women they were subversive and used a lot of ways of getting to speak the Word of God. But they were supposed to only exhort. Let's see, any questions so far? Okay, why don't you give out this? This is a painting by an American painter named John Gast, G-A-S-T. And it's called American Progress. Now, a part of the camp meetings was tied to the idea of Europeans who came to this country moving on out across the frontier and taking the land between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And this was called the idea of manifest destiny, and James K. Polk actually campaigned for president on manifest destiny, that it was America's destiny to control all of the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And when you begin to talk about the word destiny, you hear something more than just what humans have decided to do, right? That somehow there's a higher power who is governing these events and making decisions and calling people to do particular things. And so the term destiny was attached to this by Polk very deliberately and very let's just say very deliberately. Now, the Catholic Church had issued something called the Doctrine of Discovery, which said that if Christians discovered land which was owned by people who weren't Christians, that they had a God-given right to take that land. that God intended for Christians to take land that non-Christian people owned. And so this doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny really all fit together very well, and Polk used that. And this painting is understood to be a classic artistic depiction of this idea. This is Progress, and you see her garbed in what we think of as maybe a Greek goddess wearing, right? Because this is intellectual progress from Europe that is moving across the land toward the west. And so you see the telegraph wire in one of her hands, and you see a book in the other, and you see the stagecoach coming behind her here, and you see some people beginning to farm. One of the criteria for what is civilized is that people have agriculture. And the understanding is that native people did not have agriculture, but they did. They raised maize and squash and beans. But here in this picture, we see someone starting to farm. We see some miners coming along here. And we see the railroad coming in after the Conestoga wagons here. And we also see native peoples sort of being pushed off here to the west, right? Now, look at the picture overall, and there's in some ways subtle and not, in other ways not so subtle message here. Think for just a second about what the color usage in the picture is saying. Of course, this is not a perfect rendition of the color, but what I'm saying comes across. How would you say this side compares to this side? Light and dark, light and dark, light and dark, yes. So the idea that any place that European Christianity is not is going to be darkness, and that we are bringing enlightenment to the continent as it goes across. And this was just a really popular painting around the time of the centenary of the country, the 100-year mark, the late 1800s. And these ideas were understood to be something that God approved of. This is just the way that it ought to be, the Christianization of people, which is really unfortunate because one of the things that it did was bring about the boarding schools here in Oklahoma and the other places where Native children were taken from their parents, whether they wanted to go or not, put in the boarding school, and they were punished if they spoke their language. Their hair was cut, they wore Western clothes, and they were to be assimilated into the European culture. And Methodists ran a good number of those schools, and it was understood that we were doing the right thing. We were doing a really helpful thing. We were giving people Christianity. And so there was a lot of well-intentioned work on the part of church people that did not turn out to be something that we can look back and be proud of. There was a lot of work that is something we can look back and be proud of. And the movement out west was really one of the triggers for the organization of the women's organizations within the church. Women were put into a particular sphere, S-P-H-E-R-E, at that time. And you were supposed to be pious and submissive and domestic. Your place was in the home. And as women began to organize, they were very clever about how they used this particular language. And so one of the things that they began to organize for was to build parsonages for pastors out on the frontier, because some of them began to be married. Asbury hated it when his preachers got married. He never got married. But eventually some of them began to get married and have children, and they needed someplace safe to be. And so the women began to organize to build parsonages. Well, what is a parsonage? It's a home, right? And so these preachers needed homes, and who better to help work on that than women? And so the very first women's organizations were actually parsonage societies, and they raised money for parsonages. And they had an awful lot of other things in mind, which they began to accomplish and still accomplish today in terms of helping people in a myriad of ways. But at the beginning, they were very careful to use this home language. So on the frontier, they began to send money out. And in order to raise money, you have to organize. Now, the organizing to beat the devil thing that we talked about, after the Civil War, one of the most important things for people who had been enslaved was that they were able now to organize their own voluntary associations. And women, it took longer for women to get around to the point where they elbowed enough space to do that. When your children or your grandchildren began to apply for college, one of the things that they asked for is, why don't you list what extracurricular activities you've been involved with? Well, why does that matter? Why does being involved in extracurricular activities or clubs make you any better a candidate to go to college and to succeed? Again, I plan to wait till you say something. Did any of you belong to a club when you went to school? What'd you learn? One thing. Yes. That's right. Yes. You learn how to get along with other people, and you learn how to get along with other people in a particular way, in a structured way. Yes. And part of that is going to involve, we're going to need some of those people to be leaders, and you have to learn how to select people who are going to be leaders. And if you're the leader, you have to learn how to lead, and if you're not the leader, you have to learn how to get along with the leader. Yeah. So this particular kind of thing, how do you begin to select? How are we going to decide what are we going to do? How are we going to make decisions as a group of people? Are we going to elect officers? And if so, what officers? And how do you indicate that you would like to be the officer? Who wants to be the president? Who wants to be the secretary? Are we going to have dues? If we're going to get anything done, we may need a little bit of money, right? Well, where are we going to get this money from? Well, maybe we'll have dues. Maybe we have to pay a quarter to belong. Well, who's going to keep the quarters? Who's going to keep a record of who paid their quarter and who didn't pay their quarter? Who's going to actually dispense the money when an expense comes? And maybe we don't have enough money to just chip in our quarters. Maybe we're going to have to raise some money. Well, how are we going to do that? What can we do that would earn some money? Could we have a bake sale? Could we have a day when we say, we'll do the chores in your yard if you'll pay us? Think about the youth groups here. I'm sure that there are many occasions when you hear an announcement that the youth are raising money to go on a mission trip or the youth are raising money to go to camp. And somebody is going to take your money when you decide to participate in this, right? These are skills, and they're not skills you're born with. They're skills that you have to acquire, and the way that you acquire them is by becoming part of these organizations. So as the women began to organize, and as the church began to organize to do the kinds of work that needed to be done, they learned tremendous amounts of things. They learned that you need the Holy Spirit to call you, to empower you, to give you this enthusiasm, to give you this energy, to give you this commitment, this dedication, this desire to be of help to other people. And you also need to learn how to work with other people in order to do that. Because some of us, maybe, are so gifted that we could go out and save the world on our own, but I haven't met that individual yet. And as the body of Christ, the scriptures tell us we're all called to do different parts of the work in the world. And so part of that work is figuring out what is the good thing to do, figuring out how to do it. And another part of that work can be asking, are we really doing the right thing? And do we need to look back on what we have done and think through, now, was this really helpful? Or we did it thinking it was the right thing, but was it really? And do we need to maybe make a change in how we're thinking about things now? Do we need to make a change in what we have been up to? And do we need to perhaps be about different things? Do we need to apologize for what we have done? And can we recover what we've done that was right and celebrate it? We tend to reinvent the wheel over and over and over. This conference that I'm going to with United Methodist Women is a real reminder to me of that. In 1980, there was a big conference, and now the United Methodist Women are going to get their history really begun to be written down. And so now, 35 years later, we're having another conference to do the same thing that we're going to do in 1980. And one of the problems with being a historian of Methodism is that when people are thoroughly energized to go out and do good work, that they spend most of their time doing that good work and not writing down what they were doing. They don't necessarily spend their energy in documenting what they've done. The reports, yes, they're helpful, but not enough in terms of really being able to stop and celebrate what we have accomplished as church people, what we have accomplished as United Methodist church people and the predecessor organizations. So I am busy working on this paper and doing some thinking about how we go about celebrating what we as United Methodists, and particularly as United Methodist women, have been up to. And this work on the frontier has very much been women's work as well as men's work. Now, I'm going to just make you ask a question or tell me what you'd like to hear about. I've threatened you before, but now I really am. No? I said I don't have any questions, but it's very interesting. Oh, yeah. I had no idea when I was a kid that all this had gone on, that the camp meetings were ever there. Yeah. 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 Yes, ma'am.
As these women raise their standing in the community and their reputation, begin to come out that they're good at this or they're good at that, raise the standing in their community and what they did do, I guess you would say they expected
Absolutely. And some of the women who, for instance, let me use a woman in New Orleans whose story I know. Elvira Carre was her name, and she was a young widow. Her husband was a good bit older than she and died while she was still young. And she was president of the city mission board that pulled the St. Mark's Community Center and other things around the city. So she was active in the United Methodist Church, but she also brought the YWCA to New Orleans. And she was part of something called the Christian Women's Exchange, which let immigrant women who wanted to do craft work or sewing or those kinds of things to help supplement their family, they created a place where those things could be sold and the people given a fair price for what they had done. And she was part of Travelers Aid. Now, Travelers Aid is something people don't know a whole lot about, and it sounds kind of not that important. Okay, somebody comes to a city and needs some advice, and you tell them where to go. Well, no, that's not it at all. What it was really about was what we call human trafficking today, and sex trafficking. It was when young women came to the city and needed to literally be rescued from someone who was going to come and talk them into coming in. Oh, I've got a good job for you over here, which turned out to not be such a good job. So yes, these women did not stay within the confines of Methodism. They began to do some of the work through the church, but they also began to do the work through other organizations. And one thing that did was let women from different denominations actually work together in a way that they otherwise could not have done. And some of the women belonged to the League of Women Voters, and some of them worked for suffrage, women's right to vote. And the Methodists worked for women's right to vote within the church. What we don't think about is when we talk about women voting, we think about going to the voting booth and voting for a public office. Women couldn't even vote in the church. You couldn't vote if there was a charge conference in your church. You didn't vote. If you were looking at delegates to go to annual conference, they were going to elect a woman. A woman couldn't vote at annual conference. You surely couldn't vote at general conference. And in the very late 1800s, Frances Willard and 4 other women were elected as delegates to general conference. And they went off to general conference, and there was a big brouhaha about whether they could be seated or not. And the official decision was that when they said that laymen could vote, because first only clergy could vote, but then laymen got the right to vote. Laymen got the right to vote. They decided, no, laymen means lay men. And so Frances Willard did not get seated, nor the other 4 women. And it was 16 more years before women were elected and seated at general conference. So these women also voted, worked to get the right to vote in church. And they did become very well known in their communities, and they gained a lot of leadership skills. And particularly through the League of Women Voters, as time went on, the women who began to step out in leadership roles in other ways often had been trained through their work in the church. Good point. They also call it overlapping boards and interlapping boards and collective impact. If you say, I'm doing this as a United Methodist woman, well, okay. But if you say, well, this is sponsored by the United Methodist Women and the League of Women Voters and the Christian Women's Exchange and the Women's Christian Temperance Union and this group, then it begins to look like, that's a pretty serious affair, right? Elvira Carre was president of 6 organizations at one time. So when 6 organizations were standing behind something, it was just Elvira, But she had, all this clout put together by working through different groups. And one of the main groups was her church. One of her sons grew up to be president of Centenary College in Louisiana and taught at Vanderbilt. The women tended to raise up young men who were going to be leaders in the church. They were going to be the bishops. They were going to be prominent clergymen. They were going to be professors in seminaries and so forth. And this is not an accident either. Anything else? Do you have a question?
I think maybe you should tell the story about the minister's first church.
First church where? Oh. Yeah. When women get organized, men don't always like it. There was in the news just the other day somebody who had reality star who said that she hoped that when the Pope came to America, instead of talking about what he planned to talk about, he would actually talk about the over-feminization of the church, because this was a terrible problem. Well, every so often this comes up. The church has become over-feminized. Women have always been like 2/3 of the church. It's really amazing. But anyway, so in 1911 and 12 was one of these movements which comes up every some once in a while, and it was called Men and Religion Forward. The women have had charge of the church work long enough was their slogan. And so there was a pastor in New Orleans who wound up in control of the work that the women were doing there through the St. Mark's Community Center in St. Mark's Church. And he was clearly part of this Men and Religion Forward movement. So he wrote a letter to the bishop who was going to come and preside at annual conference the next year. Now we have a resident bishop. Your bishop in Oklahoma, of course, lives in Oklahoma City, and when annual conference comes around every year, that bishop is going to be the person who presides. But back when traveling was still the main feature of Methodism, a bishop lived in a particular place, but they could live anywhere they wanted to, and then every year they divided up who was going to go to what conference. So you didn't get the same bishop from year to year. And Bishop Candler, who is Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta, is named after him, was going to be the bishop that would preside in Louisiana. So this guy's name was John M. Moore. And he wrote to Bishop Candler, who was coming, to tell him about these terrible, terrible women who were just making his life awful. And he said, he used all this classical language, that it's like a hair shirt. It's like, this shirt of Nessus is working with these women. And he said that he just hoped that this bishop, who had quite a reputation with the ladies, he said, I'm not sure what he meant by that. He hoped that he would rescue him from these women. Well, one of the women that he needed rescuing from was named Mary Werline. She was part of the family down there of Werline Music Company. And she had brothers and uncles and nephews who were both Episcopal clergy and Methodist clergy. And they managed to arrange for her brother to come and take that pulpit. So when he's trying to get rid of the women and get Men and Religion Forward, actually what happened is that her brother came and took the appointment. And I am not able to find him anywhere. I have researched for ages, and he just vanished. John M. Moore never showed up again in Louisiana. So I don't know where he went, but they got her brother to come, and her brother signed, they had a petition for laity rights for women in the church there in Louisiana, and the first signature on it is S.H. Werlein. So they had no formal power, but they had that informal power, and they were able to bring her brother down who was going to support women. So, yes, ma'am.
In the paper yesterday, it was about St. Luke's, the Methodist Church closing and that it would be restarted and be they said a different Methodist church. What did they mean by that?
One of the ways that people who are experts in church growth find to be very effective in getting people to come join the church is new church starts. And people will, for some reason, come be part of a new church who will not come and be part of a church that is already established. And so when a church gets to a position, I believe it was Trinity that was in the paper yesterday, when a church gets to a point where they are not attracting younger people particularly, nowadays sometimes they actually will just say, okay, let's say that this institution is not going to be able to preserve itself. And the members at Trinity, I think, are going to go to Southern Hills Christian Church. And then they start a new church, which is actually in that building. I have not seen this be as successful as when they start a new church in a new location. Heather Nygaard Shearer has started one down in Glenpool, Living Waters United Methodist Church, and she's just done a wonderful job. They really began in a coffee house, and when they got a church, the people said, we want the church to look just like our coffee house. So they have a coffee house, and they also have a new church which looks like a coffee house. And, the people that wanted a completely different kind of atmosphere really kind of want a completely different kind of atmosphere and a different kind of setting. So I think that it's going to be interesting to see how these work out, where they just really are changing a name and calling it a new church. It may take off like gangbusters. Brookside is a great place to think about a new church start, and it may do wonderfully well.
But it won't be a new denomination.
Oh, no, it'll be a United Methodist Church. Yeah. Okay.
And then something like my sister-in-law going through in Minnesota, they're having to reorganize their church because of attendance.
Exactly. Yes. Okay, I think that's about the time that I have, and it's been good to be with you this morning, and I appreciate the invitation. And I hope that when you sit through worship this morning, you'll be thinking about a camp meeting and and how you got to where you are. Thank you.